It started on a warm Saturday morning in late May, the kind of morning when Houston felt alive before the heavy summer humidity settled in. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as I sipped my coffee, enjoying the brief peace before the day truly began. My husband, David, had already left, off on another business trip, the third one this month. He hadn't even given me time to respond before walking out the door. Just a peck on the cheek, a rushed excuse about finalizing a client deal, and then he was gone. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence I had grown too used to. That was when I heard the car pull into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Ryan step out, Ethan's best friend. He had been coming around for years, practically another son in our house. But something about him that morning made me pause. He wasn't the same lanky teenager I remembered. At 22, Ryan had filled out, his shoulders broader, his posture confident in a way that seemed out of place for someone his age. His easy smile held something unreadable, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he called as he walked toward the porch, his voice touched with that familiar Texas drawl. "Morning, Ryan. You're early," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral as I placed my coffee down. Ethan wanted to grab some food before we hit the gym. Thought I'd swing by. Ethan was still upstairs, probably scrolling on his phone, lost in whatever world 20-year-olds lived in these days. I told Ryan to come inside, and he made himself comfortable in the kitchen while I wiped down the counters, an excuse to keep my hands busy. I could feel his gaze on me. It wasn't intrusive, not inappropriate, just observant. "You're always taking care of everyone, huh?" he said after a beat of silence, his voice softer than usual. I let out a small laugh, dismissing the unexpected flutter in my stomach. "That's what moms do." His expression didn't change. "Doesn't mean someone shouldn't take care of you, too." The air between us shifted, just slightly. Before I could respond, Ethan's footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Ryan. Dude, you're early. Let's go." And just like that, the moment was gone. But the feeling lingered. That evening, when Ethan texted to say he was staying at Ryan's place, I found myself scrolling aimlessly through Instagram. It wasn't intentional. I hadn't meant to look for him. But when his profile appeared, I hesitated. His photos were casual, effortless. Shots of him at the beach, lifting weights, laughing with friends. He looked different. Older. I caught myself staring at one picture a little too long before I slammed my phone down, disgusted with myself. What was I doing? I went to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, Ryan showed up again. This time alone. Ethan had a study group, but Ryan arrived with a casual excuse. "Ethan said you needed help fixing the cabinet in the laundry room," he said, leaning against the doorframe, toolbox in hand. I blinked. "Did he now?" He grinned. "Yeah, figured I'd help. Unless you've got it under control." I didn't, of course. David had promised to fix it months ago, but work always came first. So I led Ryan to the laundry room, trying to ignore the way the space suddenly felt smaller with him in it. He worked in silence, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. Every now and then, he'd ask me to hand him a tool, and our fingers would brush, just barely, but enough to make my pulse jump. At one point, he glanced up at me, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You're nervous." "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. Ryan didn't call me out on it. Instead, he finished the repairs, standing to wipe his hands on his jeans. "There you go, Mrs. Carter. Good as new." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank you, Ryan." I expected him to leave then, but he didn't. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," he said, voice quieter now. Something inside me twisted. The doorbell rang, shattering the tension like glass. I hurried to answer it, my hands trembling. A delivery driver. Nothing significant. But when I turned back, Ryan was gone. And yet, The weight of his presence remained. That night, as I lay beside David, who was already snoring softly, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Ryan had looked at me. The way his words had made something inside me stir, something I had buried for so long I'd forgotten it existed. For the first time in years, I felt something terrifying. I felt alive. The following days were torture. I tried to convince myself that Ryan's words had been innocent, that I was overanalyzing. But the way he looked at me replayed in my mind, his voice whispering through my thoughts when I least expected it. By Wednesday, Ethan invited Ryan over again. I kept busy in the kitchen, telling myself I wasn't paying attention. But when I glanced outside, I found Ryan looking at me. He smiled. Not in a playful way, not like he used to. This smile was different. And I looked away too late. Then came Thursday. Ethan had an evening class. David, predictably, was working late again. I settled onto the couch with a glass of wine, trying to unwind, when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Ryan standing there, toolbox in hand. "Ethan said the garage door's been acting up," he said casually. I hesitated. Yeah. "It sticks sometimes. I can fix it." He stepped inside before I could process what was happening. In the garage, he crouched by the door mechanism, his movements slow, deliberate. I stood nearby, arms crossed, pretending to scroll through my phone. "You don't have to hover," he teased, glancing back at me. "I'm not hovering," I shot back, feeling my cheeks warm. When he finished, he stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Fixed it. Should be good as new." I smiled. "Thank you, Ryan." But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, watching me. "You seem distracted lately," he said, voice softer now. My stomach flipped. "I don't know what you're talking about." His gaze didn't waver. "I think you do." I took a step back, suddenly feeling the weight of what was happening. "Ryan, whatever this is, it needs to stop." He stepped closer. "What am I doing, Mrs. Carter?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my back pressing against the cold metal of the doorframe. "You know exactly what you're doing." The silence stretched between us. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment was gone. A car pulled into the driveway. "Ethan." Ryan's smirk returned as he grabbed his toolbox. "Guess I'll see you around." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing there, breathless, my heart pounding in a way I couldn't explain. The days blurred together, each one laced with an unspoken tension I refused to acknowledge. Ryan continued coming around, always with an excuse, always just a little too convenient. A forgotten item, a broken fixture, a reason to linger. And I let it happen. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that the way his eyes found mine across the room, the way his voice lowered when he spoke to me, the way his fingers lingered just a second too long when he handed me something, it was all innocent. But it wasn't. And I knew it. By Friday evening, the weight of it all was unbearable. Ethan had gone out with friends, David was predictably still at the office, and I was alone again, curled up on the couch with a book I couldn't focus on. Then the doorbell rang. I knew before I even opened the door. Ryan stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets, his usual easy smile absent. His eyes flickered with something else, something heavier. "I shouldn't have come," he said, voice low. "Then why are you here?" I whispered. He hesitated for a moment, then exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know. I should have sent him away. I should have shut the door. But instead, I stepped aside." The living room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner. Ryan stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, looking as though he was debating whether to speak. I stayed near the couch, as if keeping distance would somehow make this less dangerous. "This is wrong," I said, forcing my voice to sound firm. "You shouldn't be here." Ryan let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Then tell me to leave." I opened my mouth, but no words came. He took a step forward. Say the words, Mrs. Carter, and I'll walk out that door. I hated the way my breath caught. He reached out then, fingers brushing against mine. Just a whisper of contact. It felt like fire. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. Ryan. His gaze locked onto mine, unreadable. I see the way you look at me. I squeezed my eyes shut. You need to go. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, a car pulled into the driveway. Ryan stepped back immediately, running a hand through his hair. David. I peeked through the blinds, my stomach twisting. No, it was Ethan. Go, I whispered urgently, pushing him toward the back door. He hesitated, his fingers grazing my wrist for half a second. This isn't over. Then he was gone. I barely had time to compose myself before Ethan walked in, tossing his keys onto the table. Hey, Mom, he called, heading for the fridge. Hey, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. He didn't notice my shaking hands, but I did. By Sunday, the tension in the house was suffocating. Ethan had been quieter than usual. Maybe he sensed something was off. Or maybe I was just paranoid. David, of course, remained oblivious. He barely looked up from his laptop, muttering about upcoming deadlines, another work trip, another excuse. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. Then Monday arrived. Ryan and Ethan spent the afternoon in the backyard, playing basketball under the sweltering Texas sun. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, but every now and then, I caught myself watching. At one point, Ethan ran inside to grab a drink, leaving Ryan alone. That's when he looked up and saw me. His smirk was subtle, knowing. I turned away too late. That night, I barely slept. David was out cold beside me, snoring softly, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying every stolen glance, every quiet moment, every second of hesitation that had led me to this point. I needed to stop this before it was too late. Wednesday night, the house was still. David was working late again. Ethan had a study group. I was alone. And then the doorbell rang. I knew, even before I opened it. Ryan stood there, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said quietly. I hesitated. Ryan, this. Just talk, he interrupted. Please. I stepped aside. We ended up in the kitchen, the air thick between us. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I can't do this anymore. I swallowed. Do what? Pretend like this isn't happening, he said, voice raw. Like I don't, he stopped himself, shaking his head. I closed my eyes. Ryan, please. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you don't feel this and I'll go. I opened my mouth. The words wouldn't come. And then, a car pulled into the driveway. My stomach dropped. Not David. Ethan. Go. I hissed, panic rising in my throat. But Ryan didn't move. The front door unlocked. And just like that, everything fell apart. The second Ethan stepped through the front door, Ryan was already moving. Without a word, he slipped out the back, disappearing into the night. I barely had time to exhale before Ethan's voice cut through the tension. Hey, Mom. I forced a smile, hoping the dim lighting hid the flush in my face. Hey, sweetheart. You're home early. Ethan shrugged, tossing his keys onto the counter. Study group ended early. Figured I'd just come back. He reached into the fridge for a bottle of water, taking a long sip before turning to me, his brow furrowing slightly. Are you okay? I turned away, busying myself with wiping down the counter even though it was already spotless. Yeah, just tired. I could feel his eyes on me, as if he was trying to piece something together. For a terrifying second I thought he knew, but then he sighed and stretched. I think I'm just gonna crash. Long day. I forced myself to nod. Okay. Sleep well. I waited until his bedroom door closed before I finally let out the breath I had been holding. My hands were trembling. My pulse was racing. This was too dangerous. I needed to stop this before I lost everything. Part 5. The Weight of Silence. For the next 2 days, I avoided Ryan. I didn't text him. I didn't look at him when he came over. When Ethan and Ryan hung out in the backyard, I stayed inside, making sure there was always a wall between us. But I still felt him. His presence lingered in the house, in the stolen glances, in the way he hesitated before leaving. And worst of all, I missed it. By Friday evening, I told myself I had done the right thing, that this distance was necessary. Then the doorbell rang. I knew before I even answered. Ryan stood on the porch, hands shoved into his pockets, his usual easy confidence absent. His jaw was tight, his eyes stormy. "We need to talk," he said. I swallowed hard. "Ryan, no. This has to stop." His gaze didn't waver. "Just let me in." I should have said no, but I didn't. I stepped aside. The living room felt too small with him in it. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I can't do this anymore." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Do what?" "Pretend like this isn't real," he said, voice raw. "Pretend like I don't think about you all the damn time." My stomach twisted. "Ryan, tell me you don't feel it too," he said, stepping closer. "Tell me I'm imagining this." I opened my mouth, then closed it, because we both knew the truth. Ryan reached for me, his fingers just barely grazing my wrist. My breath hitched. "I think about you every second of the day," he murmured. "And I know I shouldn't, but I do." I was trembling. "This is wrong," I whispered. "Then tell me to leave." His eyes searched mine, waiting. I needed to say it. I had to say it. But before I could, a car pulled into the driveway. My heart stopped. "David." Ryan jerked back just as headlights swept through the window. Without a word, he disappeared through the back door, leaving me standing there, breathless and shaking. The front door opened. David walked in, looking exhausted. He barely glanced at me as he set his bag down, muttering something about a long day. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He kissed me on the cheek, his lips barely brushing my skin.
"I'm gonna shower."
I watched him disappear down the hallway, my hands still shaking. This was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. I woke up the next morning with a sinking feeling in my chest. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, suffocating. I had to fix this. I had to end it. Ethan and Ryan were in the backyard again, tossing a football back and forth. I watched from the window, my pulse racing. Ryan hadn't tried to talk to me since last night, but I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over until I made it so. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside. Ethan glanced over. "Hey, Mom." I forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart. Can you grab me some flour from the pantry?" I was thinking of baking something. Ethan raised an eyebrow but nodded, heading inside. The second the door shut, Ryan turned to me. I swallowed hard. "We need to talk."
His jaw tightened.
"I know." I hesitated, suddenly unsure how to say the words. Ryan stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me to leave." I forced myself to hold his gaze. "This has to stop," I said, my voice trembling. Ryan's face was unreadable. "Because you don't want this? Or because you're scared of what happens if you do?" I flinched. "Ryan." The back door swung open. Ethan stepped outside, holding the bag of flour. "Got it." Ryan and I jerked apart. Ethan glanced between us, frowning. Everything okay?" I forced another smile. "Of course." Ryan's expression was unreadable. Ethan handed me the flour and turned to Ryan. "Dude, you ready?" Ryan hesitated, his eyes flickering back to mine. Then finally he nodded.
"Yeah."
"Let's go." As they walked away, I felt the last piece of my resolve snap. This wasn't over. Not even close. For the next few days, I convinced myself that I had done the right thing. I kept my distance. I avoided eye contact. I forced normalcy into every interaction, pretending that nothing had ever happened. But Ryan was still there, and I could feel him watching me. Every stolen glance, every moment we passed each other in the kitchen, every second of silence that stretched too long, it all felt like a weight pressing down on me. Ethan didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own world, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. David remained absent, both physically and emotionally. He came home late, left early, and when he was around, his attention was always elsewhere. It should have made it easier. It didn't. Because the real problem wasn't David. The problem was me. Thursday evening, Ethan had a night class and David was, predictably, working late. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. The knock at the back door made my heart stop. I knew before I even looked. Ryan. He stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets, his jaw tight. His usual confidence was gone. "We need to talk," he said. I hesitated. "Ryan, this." "I'm done pretending," he interrupted, stepping inside before I could stop him. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You can't be here." He didn't move. "Then tell me to leave." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Ryan let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "You can't, can you?" My breath was shallow. "Ryan, we have to stop this." His gaze burned into mine. "Then why don't you want to?" I didn't answer. Because I didn't have one. Ryan took a step closer. "You think I don't know what this is? That I don't see the way you look at me?" I backed up against the counter, gripping the edge like it might steady me. "You're Ethan's best friend." Ryan's eyes darkened. "And I know I shouldn't want you, but I do." Silence stretched between us. Then slowly he reached out. Fingertips brushed against mine, light as a whisper. I should have pulled away. I didn't. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. I jerked back, my breath catching. Ryan's expression flickered. Regret, frustration, something else I couldn't name.
"Go," he whispered urgently.
For a second I thought he might argue. Then he nodded, slipping out the back just as the front door opened. David walked in, rubbing his temples. "Long day." I forced a smile, my heart still racing. "Dinner's in the fridge." He nodded, barely looking at me. "I'll eat later." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into his office without a second glance. I stood there for a long time, gripping the counter, trying to steady my breathing. This was spiraling out of control, and I didn't know how to stop it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan. The way he had looked at me. The way I hadn't told him to leave. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I had to end this.
For real this time.
That afternoon, Ethan and Ryan were in the backyard again, throwing a football back and forth. I stood at the window, watching, heart hammering in my chest. I needed to talk to Ryan. Alone. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside. Ethan caught sight of me first. "Hey, Mom." I forced a smile. "Ethan, can you run to the store for me? We're out of milk." He raised an eyebrow. "Can it wait?" I shook my head. I was planning to bake something later. He sighed but nodded.
"Fine."
I waited until he disappeared inside before turning to Ryan. His smirk was gone. He knew. "We can't do this," I said quietly. Ryan exhaled. "I know." But he didn't move. "Ryan, please," I whispered. He stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you don't want me." I opened my mouth. I couldn't say it. Ryan let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "Then what are we doing?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it has to stop." His jaw clenched. "You don't mean that."
He lied.
Ryan studied me for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. And then he turned and walked away. I should have felt relieved. I didn't. Instead, I felt hollow, like I had lost something I never should have wanted in the first place. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because secrets don't stay buried forever. And I was about to learn that the hard way. For the next few days, I forced myself to believe it was over. I avoided Ryan. I kept my head down, threw myself into housework, and tried to ignore the ache in my chest. But silence has a way of growing heavier with time. And soon, I realized I wasn't the only one who felt it. Ethan had started watching me differently. Not in the usual distracted, absent-minded way of a son who assumes his mother's world revolves around him.
No.
This was suspicion. I saw it in the way his eyes lingered on me too long during dinner. The way he hesitated before speaking, as if weighing whether to ask something. The way his casual questions suddenly felt like traps. And the worst part? I had no idea what he knew. Friday night, David was on another work trip. Ethan had gone out with friends. I was alone. Or so I thought. When the knock came at the back door, I felt my stomach drop. I knew. Even before I opened it. Ryan. His face was unreadable, his jaw tight.
We need to talk, he said.
I swallowed hard, glancing past him toward the driveway. Ryan, you can't be here. He stepped inside before I could stop him. This isn't over, he said, his voice low. I shut my eyes. Ryan. You don't want it to be over, he interrupted. I exhaled sharply. That doesn't matter. Doesn't it? He stepped closer, his voice softer now. Then why do you keep looking at me like that? I hated that he was right. I hated that I couldn't lie to him. But before I could say anything, the front door slammed. My blood turned to ice. Ryan and I locked eyes in mutual panic.
Ethan.
He had come home early. His footsteps echoed down the hall, each one slower than the last. Then, he appeared in the doorway. And everything stopped. Ethan's gaze flickered between us, his expression shifting from confusion to something much darker. What the hell is going on? My heart pounded. Ethan, His face twisted. Are you serious? Ethan, just listen. I tried, stepping forward. He jerked back like I had burned him. Ryan cleared his throat. Man, it's not. Shut up, Ethan snapped. His hands curled into fists. Don't talk to me. Ryan fell silent. I had never seen Ethan like this before. Betrayal, anger, disbelief. Every emotion crashed through his expression at once. This is why you've been acting weird? His voice cracked. Because you've been sneaking around with my best friend? Tears blurred my vision. Ethan, please. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Oh my God. This is insane. Ryan finally spoke. Ethan, man, I didn't mean... Ethan's fist collided with Ryan's jaw before he could finish. The sound was sickening. Ryan stumbled back, gripping his face, but he didn't fight back. Ethan was breathing hard, his fists still clenched, his body shaking. He looked at me then, his eyes glassy. Like he didn't recognize me anymore. I can't even look at you, he whispered. Then he turned and walked out. And I knew. I had lost him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ryan stood there, rubbing his jaw, but I couldn't even look at him. This was a mistake, I whispered. Ryan exhaled. Mary, leave. He flinched. Are you serious?
Now.
His throat bobbed as he swallowed, but he nodded. He left without another word. And I was alone. Again. The cost of secrets. Ethan didn't come home that night. Or the next. I called him. He ignored me. David came home Sunday evening, completely oblivious. Where's Ethan? He asked, setting his suitcase down. I forced a smile. Out with friends. The lie tasted like ash. David just nodded, already pulling out his laptop. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. And I had no one to blame but myself. Monday afternoon, my phone rang.
Ethan.
My heart leaped as I answered. Ethan? His voice was cold. I just wanted to let you know I'm staying with a friend for a while. Tears pricked my eyes. Ethan, please. Don't. His voice was sharp. I don't want to hear it. I swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Silence. Then, so am I. The line went dead. I stood there, the weight of my choices crashing down all at once. I had ruined everything, and I didn't know if I'd ever get it back. That night, I drove to the beach. The waves crashed against the shore, steady, relentless. I sat there for a long time, staring at the water, replaying every moment that had led me here. I had been looking for something. Love. Attention. A reminder that I was still alive. And in the end, I had lost the one thing that had ever truly mattered. My son. I didn't know what came next. If there was a way to fix what I had broken. If Ethan would ever forgive me. If I would ever forgive myself. But as the tide rolled in, washing over the shore, one thought echoed in my mind. Some mistakes can't be undone. And some losses are permanent.